On my last video, we took a look back on the magical summer of 1989 at the movies. This time around, I will be taking a look at the games inspired by those movies that I discussed in the video. So let's cut right to the chase. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade kicked off the summer, so let's start off with that port that was released in July of 1989 and I feel stayed true to the premise of the movie in more ways than one. The PC-DOS graphical adventure used the SCUM engine that was extremely popular those days, as it was still fairly new and quite unique in its execution, as this was the third game to utilize this new game engine. Improvements were made to it, such as adding 2 new verbs to the overall selection menu, look and talk. Hey, that was a big deal back then, okay? The story here follows the movie storyline fairly close, with some things being omitted like the Venice chase and the ending tank sequence, which, well, that alone is a shame. And that was probably due to the limitations of what the game engine and designs could not implement properly into the game. Looking back at it now, it might seem like a slow burn, but with its rich dialogue, vastly different minigame segments, and graphics, very good graphics for that time, this game is what Indiana Jones is all about. The game also had branching paths and the IQ meter, which stood for Indy Quotient, which accumulated certain points based on how you played the game and solved puzzles. This system did have its critics though, many pointing out how difficult it was to get the max amount due to the game's difficulty on some of the minigames. You know, I recall first seeing this game at a friend's house who I had recently met in high school, playing it in his Tandy, and vividly recalling this scene right here in the library. He had just figured out which book was the one needed to get past the catacombs. The game seemed crude to me, and at the time only because it had no other background sound ambience or music other than some specific scenes here and there and other short sound clips scattered about, like when you walked. That was about it. Being an owner and a fan of console gaming back then, I'm not gonna lie, I made fun of it. However, after having played Maniac Mansion on the NES and snippets of this game, I did go out and buy Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis when I got a PC of my own with an actual CD-ROM. And that game took a life of its own with background music and full digitized speech not coming to life with the advancement of that CD-ROM technology. But it all started with me with the Last Crusade title right here, on a Tandy of all places. Next up is the action game. This one was ported to many different consoles with all of them having the same style of gameplay and levels, except for one.
You must choose, but choose wisely.
This game was released in 1989, but other ports were released throughout the years, well into the 90s. If you play the action game, play the Genesis port. It's playable to an extent. Now I say that because it's very nice to look at, I love the graphics. The difficulty on it though is bad. I mean really bad. I had to use save states often, and I'm talking about quite often, to make it this far. And this is only level 2. Controls here are tricky. Indiana Jones loses health just by smacking his head on the ceiling, believe it or not. He is deathly allergic to water. Indiana Jones allergic to water. Using the whip to swing across sections is a pain as well. The other ports look bad for the most part. Most have no music. An action game with no music, however, it's not an action game, not to me. I mean, music makes the experience complete. The Master System port looks actually quite nice. Very nice animation, but there's no music at all, except for the intro and the stage screen. That's it. And then we got the NES port. So this one's a little bit interesting. There are 2 ports of this game on the NES, one by Ubisoft and one by Taito. Oh boy. The Taito version that you see right here was released in 1991. It is a very basic beat 'em up game. You punch, kick, and jump. That's it. On top of the limited style gameplay, you got a timer on each level. You know, at least the programmers knew how crappy the game was and put a time limit there for the sake of the children. I barely got out of level 1 and do not look forward to beating level 2. I'm gonna say this though, the music is actually pretty good. The Ubisoft port was released in 93 or maybe 94? Biggest question here is, why? We were 1.5 years away from the 32-bit systems. We had the Super NES, the Genesis, the 32X, CD-ROM based systems like the 3DO, and the Sega CD, and someone at Ubisoft decided to release an NES game among all that. And not only that, but to release such a horrid excuse for a game that was clearly just a port of the Game Boy game with just a change in the color palette, and I use the word color loosely here. This late in the life of a console is no doubt the result of rushing a game out just to make some money. I had no idea that such a bad game bearing the Indiana Jones name existed, but hey, here it is. Next up is Star Trek V. Now, we got no Star Trek V ports on any of the consoles, and I think all console owners back then should be thankful. In hindsight, we are very thankful. This one was released in September of '89 and was developed by Mindscape. The PC port of the movie is just pure boredom. However, it does have some nice VGA graphics thrown in there. I mean, look, aside from those nice cutscene graphics, it's all text-based, and that annoying sound playing over and over when you switch crew members. Whose idea was it to put that sound there? Why? Oh yeah, look. Great, more text, so exciting. Oh look, another text screen. Next up, Ghostbusters 2. Activision had one job here and one job only. It was simple. Don't make it like part 1. That's easy enough, right? Now, I can only assume that Activision still had the rights to the Ghostbuster brand, because after part 1, I would have filed a restraining order so Activision was not allowed anywhere near the franchise name ever again. Somehow, they still have it. They did redeem themselves though with Ghostbusters the game in 2009, but we're talking about 1989 here, and we had to deal with this one right here on the NES, because no other port for any other console was made. This one came out in April of 1990. The graphics here are a big improvement, but that's not saying much when we're talking about part 1, which set a very, very low bar. The game has 6 levels, the regular side-scrolling levels, the driving stage, and controlling the Statue of Liberty. Now, I hope you all play this level using an NES Advantage, because that would be at least a little bit more accurate than this game. The difficulty here is a major obstacle, but on top of that, you got odd controls that are hard to get used to even after playing it for a while. But if you can get past that, it isn't such a bad game. Not great, but nowhere near the atrocity level of part 1. Actually, very few games out there are. In Japan, HAL developed a Ghostbusters 2 game called New Ghostbusters 2. This port came out in December of 1990 for the Famicom only. The NES did not get a port here in the US, but we did get it on the Game Boy on December of that same year. It comes off more cartoony than the Activision version we got here in the US, and it plays like an over-the-top exploration game where you control 2 characters, with the second one basically following you around with a ghost trap. The game can get tricky at times since the second player will throw out the trap at different angles that sometimes does not line up with the ghost that you are trying to catch. It's actually not a great game since it gets repetitive real fast, but for some reason, people online say this game is great and amazing. It's, you know what, it's average at best. Try it out though if you can get your hands on it. Next up is Batman. There were a few different ports for different consoles and even an arcade game. Let's start with the Batman the Movie game released on the Commodore 64 and other computers of that time. The game follows the movie somewhat closely, and it has side-scrolling levels, driving levels, and even a stage where you pilot the Batwing as you cut the balloons off in the parade.
Those are my balloons.
The side-scrolling action stages play slow, and only because Batman moves very, very slow. Otherwise, this is a nice port of the movie, and one where I am sure kids back then were very satisfied with the gameplay and the variety of levels. It was released in November of '89. In February of 1990, we got the port that many kids out there probably played at some point in time. Sunsoft developed and published the Batman title for the NES and was praised for its graphics, the music, and the overall gameplay. Great platforming and tight controls helped this title in gaining popularity with players. The amount of details and overall gritty look fit this title quite well, plus the intro and cutscene animations were very well done and quite surprising for the NES. Sunsoft also ported it over to the Game Boy and the Genesis. The Genesis port is actually a little bit different from the Nintendo one. Whereas on the Nintendo you have more platforming, on the Genesis version you have less platforming but a lot more action, where you see a lot more enemies and it becomes more of a fighting brawler type game. The Game Boy version does away with almost all of the platforming and wall jumping mechanics found on the NES, as well as the punching, and goes with a more shooter style based gameplay. So think of it like Contra and you mix it with Batman and you got Batman on the Game Boy. Not a bad game, it's actually quite fun, and the music, I think it's terrific.
Batman.
There was also an arcade game based on the movie. It is a side-scrolling beat-em-up from Atari and was released in 1990 here in the US and ported to Japan and Europe in 1991. The graphics have that Atari look that arcade gamers back then would immediately recognize. It follows the plot of the movie and even uses digitized audio clips from the movie along with still shots in between the levels.
Napier's cleaning out active chemical.
There are side-scrolling levels where you kick, punch, and even use different weapons, as well as a grappling hook to reach higher places. You also got the driving stages, and you got a stage where you collect the balloons while piloting the Batwing. Only this time you are inside from a first-person view. Really great graphics and good overall controls with music from the movie. This is a cabinet that I wish I could have played during its initial run at the arcades. I never saw it anywhere I went to. It is a fun game and one I recommend if you have the chance to play it. It's good.
Wait till they get a load of me.
Finally, we got Lethal Weapon 2. This one is weird because technically Lethal Weapon 2 as a title was not used when the game was released. Instead, they just called the game Lethal Weapon, yet you get the cover of the games that all had Leo Getz peeking from the back. So yeah, basically the games were released in conjunction with Lethal Weapon 3, and the last boss of the Super NES game is the main villain of Part 3. So in a way, the games are more tied to Part 3 than 2, but I wanted to showcase them here just to point that out. The NES port is the most basic of basics of beat-em-ups. Out of all these games, I still think Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade point-and-click adventure game is the best and most relatable to its original content. While some games on this list are very well made, they are the exception and not the norm when it comes to licensed games. When we talk about movie-based games, the overall view is not very good. Stay tuned as I will look into this on a video sometime down the road. But the good news is that 1989 was a great year for video games all around. Even if there was nothing here for you, there were still plenty of great titles across various consoles. You had Strider and Ghouls and Ghosts on the Genesis, exceptional ports of their arcade counterparts for that time. Super Mario Bros. 3, one of the best platformers ever made. You had the superb Legendary Axe title on the TurboGrafx-16, which was the new kid on the block. Great arcade games such as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Stunt Racer, Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters, Ninja Gaiden on the NES, Revenge of Shinobi, and Willow in the arcade were just a few of the great games out there for you to enjoy. 1989 was also a time when gamers were slowly seeing a slight change of the guard. The Genesis was coming after Nintendo aggressively, and as a gamer and kid, you could start to see slight cracks in the almighty Nintendo armor. And the 16-bit market was the new horizon. The next stage in the evolution of gaming was giving gamers not only better graphics, but more gaming options, better arcade ports, upgrades to existing franchises, and more importantly, next generation technologies. This year was also the arrival of the CD-ROM format to the gaming scene, thanks to NEC. And sure, the beginning there was a bit rough and the new tech was insanely expensive, but the blueprint of what was possible was evident, and the future of gaming looked promising for the time being. The 1980s was also a great decade that saw many consoles and even a disastrous crash that almost wiped the entire industry altogether, but as we saw it wind down, it was the beginning of the next great chapter in the history of gaming. So what movie-based game from '89 overall did you find to be fun? Which disappointed you the most? Share with us all and be back here in 10 days as I look into one of the best shooters released in the early 1990s, but we somehow missed out on it here in the US and also in Europe. Until then, keep watching and keep gaming.